Today we'll talk about poverty and inequality, including some myths and misconceptions. Poverty is still a reality in our society. Jot down your thoughts on this as an economist before you move on. A very major concern today is all the inequality that we see. And a more technical term for it is equity. If you find equity too vague, you can think of inequality. They're similar in our context. The argument behind the concern for inequality is that we have enough to sustain everyone, but what if? An economic pie is an expression for economic well-being, total consumption, wealth, real GDP. And the solution here is through redistribution by taxation. That is called the Robin Hood effect. If you know the myth, that's exactly what Robin Hood used to do, steal from the rich to help the poor. The problem is that sometimes the ideal myth doesn't translate into reality so ideally. What a mess. And that is done by the welfare state, which is a form of government with two essential features. It assumes the responsibility for everyone's well-being, and it claims the right to override their freedom. There are three different levels of equity. The strongest form is equal access for everyone. Oh, isn't she cute? Or the second level is let's have a minimum social insurance, social security, or at least no inequality due to factors beyond one's control, that everyone must have the chance to progress. So pause here, record the slide number, and summarize this slide in one sentence in your own words. Equality or equity is a very valuable goal. It's a noble ideal, but it has major practical problems. When it comes to implementation, it has many complications which end up defeating its purpose. Let's look at some of these limitations. It's very subjective. There is a lot of controversy around it, and we end up spending a lot of resources in the form of political debate and legislation just to agree on what fairness means to begin with. And we can't agree. It's really a can of worms. When you have a large tax money concentrated in one place in the hands of the government, it attracts everyone's attention to appeal to the politicians and get a bigger piece of it. Remember, self-interest is at the core of human behavior for both politicians and all of those involved in the process. The project has very noble intentions, but it's easily hijacked by those who have high stakes, those with connections, those whose voices are heard more. Even among the poor, it is the ones who are relatively well off who end up getting these benefits. It doesn't really solve the problem of poverty, nor even inequality. And that's what the studies show. There has rarely been any government welfare program which made a significant effect on its objectives. This is not a coincidence. It's the law of unintended consequences. Besides, much of the wealth is wasted in the process due to all the steps and lags involved. The very nature of government is coercive, and the government's source of revenue is taxation, which is also coercive. Liberty is a high cost to pay as a society, and especially the poor, who lose their autonomy and dignity through these provisions. Welfare programs often limit the opportunities available to the poor and thus create generational poverty, which is a real problem. Remember, there is no free lunch. When someone says equality is important, you must ask at what expense. And when someone says all the inequality is bad, you must ask, what's your alternative? And that alternative better be something feasible, not a mere ideal. Pause and take notes. Sometimes poverty becomes a trap, also called the welfare trap or unemployment trap. That's when the recipients don't have the incentive to earn income. It's a very rational behavior given how the system is set up. There's a trade-off between welfare benefits and work incentives. Welfare support sharply reduces economic gains of being employed. It could even lower one's net income, including the benefits, because people will no longer be qualified for those benefits. And people respond to incentives. That's what we're creating, a society of dependence, a society where people's concern is not to empower themselves to prosper at work and be more competitive, but how to qualify for quote-unquote free benefits at the expense of the rest of the society. And we proudly call this socialism, with a lot of praise and glory. And remember, welfare benefits are generated by taxing the employers, but guess what? When the employers are taxed, they pass it on to their workers. So it is the working class who is taxed in order to fund the unemployed. And in the process, it adds to the costs of employers, reducing their ability and willingness to hire. So those on welfare are receiving these generous benefits, and they don't see any good prospects for employment. So they rationally choose to not exert as much effort voluntarily. This is distortion of incentives. Oh no, what have you done? Another consequence of all this is called crowding out. When taxes are so high, the middle class can't afford to save as much, and they don't have the incentive for it either, since they rely on the government support for a rainy day. The problem is that it reduces responsibility. Also, savings fuel long-run business investment, so the welfare state slows down economic growth. This is one of the features of Scandinavian countries. Another major problem is the incentive for tax evasion, which is illegal, or tax avoidance, which is legal, like underreporting one's income or hiring lawyers and accountants to rearrange and reframe one's tax report to qualify for exemptions, or offshoring business, seeking tax havens. And remember, multimillionaires have every incentive to do so because to them it adds up to a lot. If you see a society with a lot of luxury cars, it doesn't mean they're rich. It means they have a high tax rate because the car they drive is exempt from taxes on capital gains. So people rationally convert their financial assets into cars in order to avoid taxes. But guess which one is more productive for the society? We are taxing the kind of asset which can create jobs and increase output, thereby directing people's investments into less productive forms. Now, we also talked about the idea of equal opportunity. Even the idea of equal opportunity is flawed. Think of this. If someone works really hard and saves a lot, are they entitled to pass it on to their children? Most of us would say yes. And that is the main incentive behind people saving money, because people live forever. Now you might be like, hang on, people don't live forever. They do. They live forever through their children. And that's what their behavior shows. They behave as if they live forever because they make these calculations. But guess what? That means that the child who is receiving all that inheritance will have more opportunity than other children. Saying that all children should have equal opportunity means penalizing and disincentivizing their parents. The child's initial position is beyond the child's control, for sure, but it's very much part of their parents' incentives. And because of all this mess, the government's revenue doesn't even increase. There are many studies showing that when the tax rate is reduced, it actually increases the government revenue because the very rich will no longer have the incentive to avoid or evade it. What I want to emphasize in all this is sensitivity about incentives. That's what you need to have as economists. People are dynamic. The moment you impose something on them, they'll find a way out of it. That's why government policy is never as successful as was intended. So record this slide number and summarize it in one sentence using your own words. Did you see that? It was crushed. To sum up, we can say that the moment we decide to slice the pie equally, its size will shrink because of incentives. And that's the famous dichotomy in economics between efficiency and equity. Efficiency means maximizing society's well-being with minimum costs and maximum benefits, getting the most of our resources, which means we must choose between two options. Either have a big pie at the expense of unequal slicing, or having a little pie that is sliced more equally. Ideally, you would like to have both, a big pie and a fair share for everyone, but that's not feasible. There is no such option. We must sacrifice one for the other. So we have to set our priorities, and here's a good summary. With equity, we're more egalitarian than with efficiency. One is government-driven as opposed to market-driven. Emphasis on equality compromises individual and economic liberty and can slow down economic growth. They also differ in terms of social mobility. Societies today are different mixes of the two, attempting to get the advantages of each, but it also means getting the disadvantages of each. Oh no, what have you done? A trade-off is inevitable because there is no free lunch. There is a compromise to make either way. Any attempt to build a heaven has rather created a hell. Those who aimed at creating a socialist utopia ended up with a dystopia. It's not because they didn't follow the socialist recipe correctly, but because the recipe ignores incentives and unintended consequences. So the welfare state was born in 1930 with the Great Depression, and it has ever grown since then. And today we just take it for granted that it must be there. It's because of these practical complications of equality that economists emphasize efficiency instead and give it a higher priority. Not because equality is less important, but because in practice there are so many impediments to it which ruin the whole project. So pause here and take notes. Inequality itself is not a problem. More important than inequality is its roots. There are some forms of inequality which are justifiable and others which are less legitimate. This is the kind of sensitivity I want you to take out of the course, to dig a bit deeper and not judge based on the surface, to ask meaningful and professional questions and not blindly hop on the mainstream trend. There is a subtle yet profound difference between economic rent and economic profit. Profit is non-zero sum. It's win-win. It means more consumption for buyers, more revenue for sellers, and more job opportunities for workers. That's how a free market works. It's a voluntary exchange that makes everyone better off. Economic rent is zero sum. It's win-lose. If someone gets rich, it must be at the expense of someone else. Profit creates some added value in the process. Rent is only a transfer. So profit and rent are two ways of getting rich. One is selling a good or service that is demanded and valued with a high willingness to pay, or charging a high price on an existing good or service due to no competition because of market power and monopoly pricing. In one case, you'll have to improve your competitive edge, which is beneficial to everyone because you'll have to lower the price and enhance quality. In the other case, the way is to lobby for government intervention to gain a privileged position, and that comes at the expense of the consumers and taxpayers. It's all about where the resources are directed based on the highest expected value. In a society where the government makes most of the decisions, then companies have the incentive to suck up to the government by satisfying political parties. And that's the most rational thing to do. But if the decisions are made by the consumers in a market, then you'll have to appeal to the consumers by providing satisfying products. And inequality increases in both cases. But notice the difference. So the next time you hear someone talk about all the inequality between the rich and the poor, stop them right there and ask them, have you distinguished between the sources of their income? It's unprofessional and unfair to treat all inequality in the same way. Equality is so precious that we can't afford it. Oh no, I shouldn't have said that. A good example of profit versus rent is Uber versus taxi. Taxi drivers were earning a lot of rent before because they were licensed and they were in limited supply. There were few licenses for them. So they could charge almost monopoly prices. Uber made a lot of money, but through the market mechanism by providing affordable transportation to the riders and many jobs to millions of people. So the owners and shareholders of Uber got rich, but not in the same way as taxi drivers would get rich. So pause here, record this slide number, and summarize it. It's also important to distinguish between income inequality and wealth inequality. They're quite different actually. Income is a stream of earnings, ongoing. Wealth is a stock of property or assets, accumulated. Profit and rent are forms of income, and in terms of wealth, what matters again is not so much the size of wealth, but the form of wealth. If most of the wealth is in the form of mansions and yachts, then they're not very productive. They're not contributing to the society's well-being. It becomes zero sum. Oh no, what a mess. However, most of the wealth of the multimillionaires is in the form, oh, that's so cool. This is the form of assets which generate GDP and jobs. And this data is from the US. They don't take away opportunity from others. That kind of capital requires labor to work on it. It's not a substitute to labor, but a complement, right? So that's like business assets. These are the kinds of things that you never hear in public media or political debates. What you get there is the most superficial rhetoric without any nuance, only meant to stir the audience's emotions and bitterness without engaging them intellectually. And at the bottom of it all is envy, unfortunately. If we don't have some privilege, then let's drag down everyone to our level. That seems to be the bottom line of the inequality rhetoric anyway. Not to mention how the entire inequality debate is so subjective and arbitrary. What is our point of reference? Why compare ourselves to the top 1% today? Why not compare ourselves to the top 1% of 200 years ago? For instance, this dude, nice haircut, buddy. Look, he's not my boyfriend, but I feel bad for how much hatred is directed at him. just because of his wealth, just because he's been successful. But he made that wealth by providing something of value to the society and enhancing the lives of consumers. If we criticize him, fine, but let's also admit all the added value and social well-being he generated. And most of his wealth is in the form of Amazon shares, investment capital that creates opportunities for others to rise up. Anyway, all of us, including Jeff, have limitations and room for improvement. And public equities are often a form of dodging taxes. Remember unintended consequences? But still, they recycle into the society, though not in the most efficient or productive way. So you don't have to take notes on the data here, but write the gist of the message in one sentence in your own words. Nice. Origami. All right, poverty is often measured in one of two ways. The absolute poverty line is a dollar amount. The World Bank's line is about $2 per day, adjusted for local price differences. It's having a basic standard of living, which is measured by GDP per capita. The relative poverty line is more fluid and depends on what others have. Y is usually 50% or 60% in Europe. Median means the middle person, almost like the average. So look it up if you don't know what it means. This is really the same as inequality, because if everyone's income doubles, then absolute poverty falls, but it won't change the relative poverty rate at all. So we can never get rid of relative poverty unless everyone has the same income. Now you might be like, hang on, which one's better? And the answer is that both of them are a mess. What I want you to get here is that whenever you hear about poverty rates and trends, always inquire about their measure, because they often don't say it. And it can be quite misleading, because when we say poverty, most people, what they understand is significant material deprivation, the inability to provide one's family the basics of food, shelter, clothing, and medical care. So there are some reports saying that 1 in 7 people are poor, or 30 million Americans are poor. The thing is, the majority of people in the world envy the living conditions of those whom we label as poor. So you really want to be careful about what is being labeled and classified as poor and what conclusions they draw from it. There are some major problems with both the absolute and the relative measures of poverty. First, a disclaimer. This is not to deny or undervalue anyone's suffering. If anything, economics is exactly about enhancing the well-being of the greatest number of people possible. But economics also teaches us that there is no free lunch. So we want to see how the data is collected and what is at stake. Both relative and absolute poverty are subjective. They vary across time and place. Nowadays, in developed countries, one could have a car, air conditioning, and video games and still be classified as poor. And I'm not exaggerating. You see this in the reports. But go to some developing countries. If they have clean water, a roof above their head, and a floor under their feet, they would be among the most well-off in their town. These measures don't include new products which didn't exist before. And I don't mean fancy things like digital stuff, but exactly those things which we take for granted, like running water and basic sanitation. These are the daughters of the last Tsar of Russia. They had to shave their head in 1917 because of measles. Nowadays, most people, including the poor, are vaccinated against it. The last emperor of Germany had a short left arm due to nerve damage during his birth. These were the richest people of their time. It's true that there are still many defects and disorders and some new ones. What a mess. But it's undisputable that medical science and technology have improved so much that even the poorest people today have a much higher level of well-being and lower risks. Maternal and infant mortality rates have dropped significantly, and life expectancy has increased a lot. But you don't see any of that in any reports on poverty or inequality. Now, is that fair? And all this is thanks to better technology. If you want lasting improvement in the lives of the poor, we must see what is most conducive to technological advancement. And the answer is clear: competition. To the extent that firms operate in a free competitive environment, they'll have the incentive to innovate and develop new technologies. That's the solution. Okay, let me also say this. We are really ungrateful people. There is no acknowledgement about how much even the poorest people today are privileged compared to anyone in the past. If you think the world is unfair, of course it is, but it is unfair in our favor, especially for us living in the developed world. We feel miserable only when we compare ourselves with those 10% who have more than us. What about the other 90%? What about everyone 100 years ago? We feel entitled to everything that we have and to everything that we don't have. We blame the rich for being greedy, but in doing so, we are ourselves being greedy and jealous. Most data on inequality are based on households, partly because they're based on tax returns. And it kind of makes sense since living conditions are determined by the household income. The problem is that households vary a lot in terms of size and over time. The 20% households at the bottom have less total population than the highest 20%. So the gap between them will be exaggerated since they're given equal weight. Household size also varies across ethnic backgrounds. Capital gain is the increase in the value of real estate or stocks when they're sold, which adds to the income of the last year. But the value was accumulated over several years. The thing is, income statistics mix it with salary data because it's hard to distinguish. So they result in spikes of high income in a single year, which should really be divided across the years. Transfers should include not only monetary payments like welfare, pension, and child benefit, but also must include in-kind transfers like food stamps and Medicare. Income statistics usually miss that, therefore exaggerating poverty levels. And the greatest problem of all is that most studies look at snapshots of the economy. They take a cross-section from 10 years ago and one from today. But those are not the same people. To measure real poverty, you need to follow the same individual or household over time. There are some longitudinal studies, and they completely shift our perspective on where the problem is. People rarely remain in the same income bracket for more than a decade. And all this is because of life cycle patterns, which are very important to take into account. It's only natural that when you're a student, your income would be lower and you would be among the poor. But that's not something to panic about. What's important is whether you get to rise up in your 30s and 40s. And it's normal that your grandparents would own a house, maybe a cottage, because they had the time to save up. Remember, poverty is inevitable. It happens, unfortunately, because people become orphans, handicapped, or bankrupt. The real problem isn't so much episodic poverty, but chronic poverty and intergenerational poverty, when one is stuck in a low income bracket and their children don't have much prospects of moving up. So this is super important sensitivity that I want you to develop. When you hear about the bottom quintile or the top 10% having gone down or up, that's literally comparing apples and oranges because they're not the same people over time. So record this slide number and summarize it using your own words. To wrap up, there is a lot of debate over inequality, but inequality itself is not the biggest problem. More important is poverty, but we're still not there. The most meaningful measure is neither inequality nor poverty, but mobility. To what extent there is movement within the income distribution is also called social mobility. So whenever you hear a discussion about inequality, pause, because they're putting the focus on the wrong parameter. The real issue is mobility, which is applicable to each individual and across generations. So for individuals, the main determinant here is to what extent they can accumulate human capital, and what really matters there is job retention. So you see, for instance, single mothers often have low mobility because their job retention is low. Now, mobility is a double-edged sword because it means people can also go down. And the net effect is that there's going to be episodic or transitional poverty, but not so much chronic poverty. And that's what we see in Canada. Even using a relative measure, about 90% of households in the bottom quintile exited within 2 decades. That's promising. Transitional poverty shouldn't be a surprise because, c'est la vie. Life has ups and downs. The government interfering to remove even transitional poverty is impatience, and it has unintended consequences. By the way, the core of all government intervention is an element of impatience. Now, at the social level, income mobility is positively correlated to economic freedom, which itself has several elements. Oh, that's cool. So the idea here is that the bigger the government in terms of its spending and taxing, the more regulations, the more protectionism, and the more license requirements will hurt disproportionately those at the bottom of the income ladder compared to those at the top. They would slow down the wage growth for those at the bottom and increase their living expenses more so than the rest of the society. So if you want improvements in income mobility, we must reduce these impediments. The question isn't how far apart the rungs of the ladder are, but what are the chances of individuals to climb up? And it hasn't diminished. pause here and take notes. You might have heard that the rich is getting richer, the poor is getting poorer. Well, sorry, that's a fallacy. I mean, first of all, the most important part of this fallacy is that these are not the same people over time, as I emphasized. But also, all the boats are rising, though at a different rate. Another more valid concern is that if we have a lot of people with significantly more income or more wealth, then they could rig the political system. But this also is a fallacy. Why? Because again, these are not the same people, and also because of the importance of income mobility. So they're going to be, as long as there's income mobility, those at the top are also changing. Besides, the political surveys show that the orientations of those at the top and bottom and middle are not significantly different. Thanks for your patience. There's a lot more to say, and I wanted to show you some data, but I'm out of time. I just want you to have the sensitivity to ask professional and meaningful questions in the inequality debate, which has become so fashionable nowadays, so that you don't fall for the common misconceptions and myths. So here are a few questions for your practice to make sure you're following along, and make sure you use the lesson material from today as you answer these questions. So record the slide number and pause here. Today we talked about a few forms of poverty. Chronic poverty can turn into generational, which would limit income mobility. Absolute poverty is measured by the standard of living, which is caused by economic growth. Relative poverty is the same as inequality, which can be caused by economic rent, which is zero-sum. Inequality can also be caused by economic profit, which is non-zero-sum and which fuels economic growth. And there's a trade-off between equity and efficiency. Voluntary poverty and a poverty trap can be caused by the welfare state, which is fueled by taxation, which can distort incentives. The welfare state is also susceptible to lobbying and is based on paternalism, which itself limits income mobility. So in all this mess, what I really want you to get is the concept and importance of income mobility, as well as the difference between zero-sum and non-zero-sum. So pause here and draw your own concept map. This one's kind of messy. You can make it a little bit neater. If you can, then that's awesome. But make sure it's your own. Given today's lesson, how would you answer the guiding questions? Pause here and write down your updated answers, and they should show some improvement in your thinking. So a sample student answer is that in terms of incentives, we're talking about the expected value calculation, and we must distinguish between episodic and chronic poverty. The government may have the incentive to act as the Robin Hood, and in addition to money, to provide in-kind transfers. That will likely distort the incentives for both the poor and the wealthy. The alternative is to realize that transitional poverty is inevitable and not to panic about it, and that what matters at the end of the day is social mobility, which is a matter of economic freedom. Have a great day.